Hi, everybody. This is Jeff Saltzman. I'm the CEO of OrgVitality. Welcome to our webinar series, Fireside Chats. This is the third in a series of 5 chats we are having. And today we're very excited that Kelly Wojda is going to be joining us for our Fireside Chat. Kelly is the Vice President of Learning and Development for Caterpillar. One of the largest, most successful organizations on the planet, the Fortune 100 company with over 107,000 employees and $51 billion in sales and revenue. They basically have a footprint in almost every country. She began leading the learning and development team in 2018. Lots of change has happened since 2018, which is part of what we're going to be covering. And in this role, she sets the strategy and builds expert teams responsible for leadership development, professional skill building, and team development, learning data analytics, technology, system administration, company-wide employee experience and assessment programs, and I'm sure a whole bunch of other things that come her way. Prior to this role, she was the Director of Talent and Diversity, a role where she focused on recruitment and succession for key roles, as well as highlighting hidden talent with the global female and ethnically diverse talent reviews. So we're going to present with Kelly today. We're going to try and save some question time for the end, but you'll notice at the bottom of her description of who she is, there's an email address. And if we don't get to your questions, Kelly has very graciously offered to respond to questions one-on-one if you identify yourself in the question. So welcome, Kelly, to our Fireside Chat.
Well, hi, Jeff. Nice to see you again. I think this might be a continuation of a conversation we had over a pizza months back in Chicago pizza, I'll say, not New York pizza, but
a famous Chicago pizza.
That's right. That's right.
Which can hold its own against the New York pizza. Yeah. Right. I'm going to have people throwing tomatoes at me, but yes, I can. So what we'd like to do is, as we go, by the way, and as we have a conversation, if you do have questions, you'll see on the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon that says Q&A. Please click on the Q&A and put your questions in there. And if you identify yourself, and again, if we don't get to your question, we'll respond after the session is over, but we're going to try and get to the questions towards the end of the session. Let me take down the PowerPoint for a moment so you can see, or you can see the videos now, right? So here we are. Again, welcome, Kelly, and let's jump right in if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So you've been at Caterpillar for a fairly significant amount of time.
That's right.
Can you describe sort of your journey from your early career to where you are now and the steps that you took along the way to get to the role you're in?
Yeah, so it's been a long time. It's been about 3 decades, and so I won't bore with you with all the details. But I actually started out as an accountant, and I had loved both the idea of business and also the idea of telling stories and writing stories, and so I couldn't quite choose what I wanted to do for my career. But once I got into CAT, I grew up in Peoria, Illinois, where it was headquartered at the time, and my family worked for CAT. So, but in business school, we learned a lot about the company it was becoming with, at that time, it was Harvard Business Reviews around globalization and Japan. And that was sort of the era that I was coming of age. And so I thought, this is a really cool company. I want to kind of know it. And I want to know it in contrast to like what a family experience is and individual experiences. My dad, my uncles, my maternal grandmother, who was a Rosie the Riveter at the company. So anyway, but I pretty soon learned that accounting wasn't my calling. And so I started volunteering for things. We talked a little bit about how important it is for folks on this call to be thinking about their careers. This is really pretty noble work. It's soul work in some ways. And I knew that accounting wasn't it for me. And by volunteering, I got a chance to go into communications, which is a lot about the relationship between, a leader and an employee. And so that's really how I transitioned into about 10 years of communications, and then about 10 years of HR. And sprinkled in the midst of that was employee surveys, employee research, and a little bit of customer research with market research. And so that's a bit of what I sampled in my career.
So if I think about HR, and you certainly were sort of, as an accountant, you're sort of fairly different than what an HR practice might be. What was it about sort of HR itself that sort of you found appealing?
Yeah, it is really this idea of the relationship between an employee and other employees, the relationship between an employee and their leader, and the relationship between employees and an organization. Caterpillar is a huge company, as you mentioned, 107,000 employees. And so how individuals come together is really fascinating to me. It's been sort of the single thread through my career. And I've always loved that. I've loved to learn, which is a wonderful thing that I ended up where I am, because it's given me that opportunity to focus on that.
That sounds great. Thank you. So, as you said, it's been roughly 30 years that you've been there. And I'm sure over that time, there's been a lot of change in Caterpillar. So think back to when you started and think about where it is today, and maybe even where you hope it is in 10 years from now. What has changed in your area in terms of talent management, in terms of surveys and 360s, all that? What, by the way, did you even do 360s 30 years ago? Probably not, right? I don't think they existed. But talk about that story for us.
Yeah. So, I could tell it chronologically, but probably this dates back to more than most of the audience members are old. So maybe I could start by orienting everybody to our current team, because that's super proud of the current team. And then we can maybe contrast that to what I inherited back in the day. But so we have a survey is going on right now. And the one true thread through line of that entire time, I think, is the capability and the talent of the team. I have learned over time is that if you can build a really talented team, they can do amazing things. And if there's any contribution I make to this field, it's trying to make that possible. And let me tell you, about a year and a half ago, we had an opportunity, and we've had some awesome people over time that have participated in the employee survey and our 360s, our upward feedback. But we hired a guy named Steve Young, who came to us with a PhD and a dozen years of surveying small and large companies and government work and corporate work and the consulting side. And he really brought a new rigor, a new sense of the science, as well as an EQ that I really saw in the interview process. I noted that he not only had the deep expertise, but he also had done some work in the community that was impressive. And and is kind of a funny story. I don't know if Steve's on, but I don't mean to embarrass him. But on the interview, we were like, yeah, this looks really good. We had the head of our the guy who has a talent analytics and IT and business resources for HR, and then one of our business partners on my peer team who runs our resource industries. And Steve asked about, what are your biggest business issues that I might contribute to? And Catherine brought up attrition, which I think a year and a half ago and still today is on everybody's mind. And she's talking about attrition, and she's getting some free consulting on this interview. And I'm thinking, okay, let's people do stay. They stay for a long time. It's a really great company. So I wanted to make sure he had that impression. And but he did come to us and has brought a lot to the team. We also have Julia Lewis on the team. Julia had been working in office management and things for different nonprofits, and then came to CAT, worked for different directors as an assistant, and recognized the what she has in terms of organizational savvy and again EQ. She can say no to someone and make them realize, oh yeah, that was really a good decision. That's great. And so having Julia part of our team has really been great. She helped kind of Steve navigate and create a sense of community. And then it became clear that there was opportunity for them to build. And so we posted for another role, and Steve has proven to be a good talent scout and brought in Krista Carter. So Krista came to us where she wore a lot of different hats at a smaller company, both on the deep design, also a PhD, but also had a wonderful sense of presenting results and working with leaders. And so they're a really awesome team. And I think that, makes a difference. And again, it's partners like yourself and also partners that we have internally. So we work with our communications team and our talent analytics team and IT team, so across the board. But having that kind of capability for us has really put a focus in an organization that's pretty technical. Has offered to kind of ease out the way of explaining what we do and why we do it that way, and then keeping a real good rigor on the science.
So it's as you described, this team you put together, as the impetus for creating this team, a desire to increase the sophistication of the tools that you use day to day?
Yeah, I think we were pretty fortunate to have, a leadership team that is both interested in the work and, also pretty demanding. And so it became clear to me that having two stakeholders in mind and having a team that can keep up with, with the demands of those. And when I say stakeholders, there's an array of them. But two that we try to keep in mind is, first, the people are paying us to do it. So thinking about our executive team and their needs, and they are very focused. And so being able to focus on the why and why it matters, keeping it simple and straightforward. And that's what I love about this team. Mm-hmm. And then the other group of constituents is, the employees, the beneficiaries of the work.
Sure.
So there's a balance in keeping both stakeholder groups in mind.
So with the 360s you do and the employee surveys you do, has it been a pull from like senior executives saying we should be doing this? Or has it been sort of a push up from the professional staff saying this is something a company of this size should be doing? What's the driving force of this?
Yeah. So, I think if I looked at where it is today, maybe versus, when I started, I think there's a recognition that engagement and, focusing on what matters to your employees makes a big difference. And, I say that, but I don't want to assume that it's taken for granted. And maybe I could just share a little bit of story.
Sure.
So in 2017 and 18, we had a changeover in our CHRO and our CEO, and they had a strategic planning committee. And we'd done a lot of work with the team then to really think about how our employee surveys matched up with some of that strategic work. And it was good work. And I think Alan was saying too that, longer surveys and surveys with, different kind of ownership groups was important. And we were doing that. But in doing so, the survey got very long. And that was something that to our CHRO and our CEO was concerning. Now, I didn't quite recognize what the issue was, but I was getting little bits and pieces of feedback, which lesson learned I probably should have leaned into. And that would be something I'd keep, sharing with this audience, is that if your stakeholders are sharing something with you, lean into it. Don't just try to keep going and thinking it will. It's important what they think. And
they're saying that for a reason, right?
They are.
Yeah.
They are. And so I didn't know if it was, a new CHRO, maybe she wasn't as invested. But I think she was trying to channel that there were some concerns. And a week before we were to launch the survey in 2018, And again, I can hear gasps from the audience, but we put a pause on our survey. And this came from an executive meeting that my boss was part of, our CHRO. And she said, I don't think they're quite ready for this. And they stepped back, and we had been doing it, for some time. So I said, do you mind if I come back? Because I just like to hear it straight from them. Like, what is it? So communicated the delay, which was heartbreaking,
right.
A lot of unwinding of things. And then I came back and sat with our top 8 people, our CEO and the top 8 people. And they, they were a new leadership team. And, I just had the foresight to just lay the question out there. And I said, do you believe this is important? And they kind of were taken a little bit aback. They were ready for some advocacy from a group like ours. And they paused, and Jim Umpleby, our CEO, stopped, and he said, I'd like to hear, from the group. And so they went around, and the stories they told about the importance of engagement and a new strategy and alignment to that strategy and knowing whether people were with them were inspiring to me. I didn't really expect it. And, there were a few days here, I was like, well, I'm not sure if people, put the time and energy into it. And, I had about 3 seconds of, our careless responder study, able to say, oh, I actually do. And, but they were listening, and it was important to them, which was really heartening for me. I could have taken away okay, they don't believe in it, but they did believe in it. And it was much easier problem to fix by reframing it from their point of view. They just thought it was long. They didn't know why certain questions were asked. They didn't understand whether it was getting a bit unwieldy. And so while it was a ton of pressure for the team to work toward their requirements, we were able to do that and kind of get the survey back on track. And I guess that's another lesson learned, is that lean into it, but also get your next date when you're going to do it. Right. Because it's important continuity wise.
Well, it sounds like that activity actually probably increased the buy-in to the process quite a bit.
Yeah.
When you have the senior leadership team saying, let me tell you what this means to me, and they say nice things.
Yeah,
that has to be a good thing. But I'm curious, when I've heard this many times over the years about, you start with a survey, and then this group wants to add a few questions, and that group wants to add a few questions, and pretty soon you got a 150 question survey. So when you took the pause with this long questionnaire, did you take out a knife and just say, let's start from scratch, or did you just prune a little bit here and there?
No, we actually kind of started with 2 principles that came out of that meeting. One was that they believed in engagement, and they wanted to measure engagement, drivers of engagement as well. And then they wanted to understand where they were with their strategy, direction, and execution. And so those 2 became 2 kind of anchors for the survey. And then we said, we kind of created almost an arbitrary, let's get it shorter. And then had a really strong team that was able to kind of put that together. It's the same design now, but but so many things have changed after we get the results and how we think about the time outcomes.
So it's an interest. If I'm interpreting you right, it's like, you may ask about decision making, you may ask about communications and training, but only if those things align with the strategy of what the corporation is trying to achieve, as opposed to saying, here's a variety of HR topics that a standard survey will often ask about. What you wanted to do is customize that standard to fit Caterpillar's strategy going forward. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, no, that's a perfect way of putting it.
Yeah. So if you think about where you're going, say over the next 5-10 years with this, what do you think is going to change with respect to employee surveys at Caterpillar or 360? What are you hoping for in terms of the future?
Yeah, that's super exciting to me, especially with the team we have now and their capabilities. Being able to kind of brainstorm with other companies we benchmark, or with yourselves, and think about what might come next. I say it's probably in 2 different angles. So on one side, it is really stressing the human side. So after the after the results come out and people have their results, the leaders and, the employee that put voice to it, are we taking action that matters? And so there's a human side of supporting that leader. So just tonight, actually, I finished my 6 months of coaching training. It's something that we do at our leadership development team. We have some internal coaches that I'm super proud of that work with our mid-managers. And I said, I'd like to do that too. So I'm just finishing that. But we have seen, whether it's the internal coaching at mid-managers, the more external at the senior levels, or sort of the telehealth coaching that we do for our first line, there's a huge demand for that. And I think the flexibility that people have post-COVID, at least in our organization, for how people work, it puts a lot of new demands on that leader. And so we're looking at that supportive coaching. And then on the other side, for the business side, we started some work last year. I told that attrition story during the interview. And so we really dove into what can we learn about attrition based on what results we have from our survey. And so we did an outcome study, and we're able to, say if you have one tick point up on this index, it will impact the attrition issue in this way. And another lesson learned, not only the HRE side, but on the financial side, when we presented results, we had done from that outcome study, hey, here's the financial impact of that reduction in attrition. And as we were kind of reviewing with different stakeholders, getting ready for the executive team, my boss, our CHRO, said, it's not just the dollars, it's the disruption of attrition. You have a line that doesn't have a teammate. Now you have maybe a supply chain is already an issue, and now you have to wait for hiring. You have to wait for safety issues with new people coming in. So we talked a lot about impacting a smoother operation as an outcome.
Longer term. You mentioned in your response there, you mentioned COVID. And I'm just wondering, and that some of the demands on leaders have really changed because of COVID, and that you're looking at, coaching as a way to help them meet the new demands of the organization. Can you describe that a little bit? How are you guys adapting to this new COVID environment? For instance, is everybody back? Is corporate back in the office, or are you still working from home? And how do leaders manage a remote workforce if they're still remote?
Yeah. So, all the way through the pandemic, we had about 80% of our production workers that were still working in the factory. And so they have learned from one another. And it changed the way we even administer the survey. We'd go to training rooms and we had to really think about, what can we do to make that better? So QR codes for touchless administration, thinking about adding some time to the administration window. But in general, what that meant as people were coming in was that there was a lot more focus on the needs of our production workforce. And so people really, the value to that community was elevated. And I'd say for the people who work in offices, we've said to our folks, there's a lot of value in the way people come together in community, but not all work requires that, or all work benefits from that. So we've left it to each leader to think through, well, what does it mean for your work group? And where we can, we come together. And
right. So rather than painting with a broad brush of everybody has to be back, it's more localized. What does this group need? What are their requirements, and so forth?
Yeah, and that's a big change for leaders too, because then the question comes. So, we learn a lot through our 360s. We learn a lot through our employee survey about how that group is doing. But there's a lot on their shoulders. And so along with the coaching, we've also really ramped up our first line leader training, just so that they have also a sense of community, so about 40% of our first line leaders will go through training this year.
So does that training include things like how to manage a remote workforce, things like that?
Yeah, so it's interesting because more of the cohorts, so the business decides whether they want fully digital, fully in person, or hybrid, and whether they want manufacturing or office workers or together. And we found that there is a real need for mixed groups, because they this sort of understanding of how much we rely on each other has really increased over COVID. And so we've seen that tick up. We've also seen that tick up in, some of the questions that come to our team. So, can we do more to think through how our production workforce is operating and where there might be problem areas and those types of things.
And this may be a little far afield, but you guys are in almost every country, right? You're in the majority of countries. That what you describe, I'm sure is happening in the US, maybe in Europe and things like. But what happens in more remote corners of the world? Does it apply to all countries, or is it there's more variation as you get away from your major centers?
Yeah. Do you mean the COVID response, or are you talking more?
Well, the hybrid workforce, the COVID response, the training that you're doing for managers, the coaching, things like that. Are you trying that on a global basis, or is it more localized?
Yeah, no, it is definitely global, but we put as much decision-making power in the hands of the business as we can. So, we are surveying across the board. So there's definitely that kind of support. And then we have coordinators, some of who have passed through our group as sort of stretch assignments, which we really appreciate. But then, they are in the field. So from a survey standpoint, from a leadership development standpoint, we started actually in China and Mexico with those programs. So even though the program managers on my team might be based in the United States or in Europe, they're managing, those programs with wherever the business wants to start. And it happened to be China and Mexico.
So you do take a global orientation on all these programs as opposed to just a local orientation. That's very interesting.
That's a real hallmark of CAT. So it's been that way. So the first employee survey I did was when the number still started with 19. So 1999 was when I had my first job with employee surveys. And I remember working through a translation, and we had about 5 or 6 different countries that were using Spanish, but Spanish in different, local dialects, and trying to get them to harmonize on one version of Spanish that made sense. And I organized a call, and I remember quite quickly realizing I don't speak Spanish, and I've got about 8 Spanish speakers here trying to come together. And so quickly I had to get on another office phone at the time, calling people saying, "Kate, can you translate? Hey, do you mind if you could take notes in English?" And but that's the power of the team.
I have to say, one of my own little stories. I was doing an employee survey for Fiat, and I was in Milan at their corporate headquarters, and they brought in 3 translators to take the English that we had written and to translate it into first the Italian before they went to other languages. And I was in the room with those translators for 2 days, and they were arguing and couldn't agree on a translation. And it was 2 of the most painful days of my life, like listening to them argue about should it be this word or that word, or that kind of thing. So there are some real challenges with sort of a global approach to these things. It's important, but I think people really have to be ready for some of the challenges that they face when they go in that direction.
We could probably tell war stories all day, but I'll have another quick one. And this may make people feel better on the phone if, I won't mention the name, but the survey wasn't in my group, and I just empathized with the leader of the group at the time. We were doing a lot more promotion at one time, and maybe got just a little too clever with some of the promotions. And there was a whole campaign around, share your pride. I think it was more like pride or fidelity to the company, or loyalty or something was the sentiment. And in the promotions in Japan for the survey, whatever words were used, it was more like romantic love. So I was supporting that.
Right. Engagement isn't a word that always translates exactly the right way. Yes. Sure. And that happens with a few things. Yes. Yeah. So, do you see Caterpillar sort of, again, going to the future, So you're on an annual cadence now of a census survey. Do you see that changing at all? Do you see it going every other year? Do you see it going twice a year? Or is once a year? I mean, it's a big company, so it's a big effort. But do you see that? Is that the direction it's going to stay, this once a year census kind of thing?
I'm a big fan of that. I know everybody's not. What I like about it is that there's opportunity then to really focus on, both the business side of the outcome. What are we really driving? What does this say? And so we did attrition, as I mentioned, and safety. We're interested in kind of tackling things like quality, accountable profit, over time. So you have time to do that, but you also have time. More importantly, I think is to take action. And these are not usually small things. So we've experimented again at various times through our history. We did a quarterly pulse where we randomized the sample of employees, and I again was on the business side and communicating those results. And it wasn't the employees that got fatigued because it was a different group at each time, but it was the management that got fatigued, and they couldn't have a systemic approach. They were always analyzing data. And for some of our leaders, analyzing data, is much more comfortable than taking action. So we didn't want to encourage that. We want to encourage the action.
Yes, that's yeah. There was I'm blocking on the guy's name. There was a guy from Eli Lilly who once said to me, when we do surveys, we have to be careful. Are we actually listening, or are we simply doing continuous asking?
Yeah.
The notion of you just keep asking, and nothing happens, your process will eventually collapse on itself.
Yeah. If I share a story on that, because it kind
sure.
of stakeholders too. So over the years, various times our board has asked for updates on our results, and I think consistently now our CEO or CHR will share the results, but at that time they wanted a deeper dive, and so I've had the opportunity a few times to share those results. And a particular story related to that action comes to mind. We had a board member, and if you haven't worked with boards, just think of the super smart people that have like very little depth on your subject, but have like all kinds of things that they have in their perspective toolkits. And so we had a gentleman who was the ambassador to, he'd been the ambassador to Singapore and China and Russia under two different administrations. And he was part of the audience that was listening as our board. And he noted in the data that I was sharing that some of the groups had low engagement, but low attrition. And he said, that's not a good thing. That's could be less healthy than, and so then he said, I work in people terms. I'm a diplomat. Can you tell me a person's story of how they're working that issue? And, you had your cheat sheet of what you're going to say. And, but we had done some lunch and learns. And so, sorry, it's a little unwilling, but I told him a story that maybe I could tell you for a minute, is that one of those lunch and learns, we had a gentleman that came and said that he had been promoted because of his technical expertise time and time again. And he had been working to get his team behind him with some shifts in R&D, where we had periods where maybe our funding had changed. And he really wanted the team behind him, but his survey scores were showing him that they weren't necessarily with him. And he went to his talent consultants who sent him leadership books and other things. And then they came to our corporate team and asked for some help. And we had a wonderful woman named Margie at the time, all heart. And so she listened to his story. And this is as a gentleman is sharing it at a lunch and learn, and said, Margie asked me, did I talk to my team? And I had not. And so I talked to the team, and then she said, well, do you usually say hello to people in the morning? No, I just kind of go to work. When you travel, do you have lunch with people and just see what they're feeling about some of these things? No, I don't. Well, maybe we just start small. Maybe we start small with hello. And so he shared this story and how slowly but surely people started coming to him with issues. He started talking to people about some of their concerns. And then over time, his survey scores went up. And so he shared this story with the Lunch and Learn. And I was able to recall it when I was in that board meeting and share it with the board. And it's that kind of human story, that emotion, I think, that helps people get their heads around why this is so critical. Another one of the board members said, that could really, terrible analogy for our business, but said, that could be a canary in the coal mine that really, tells you where something's wrong before, dangerous things happen. So I think there's a risk kind of aversion standpoint, and then there's sort of the human potential of a leader like this guy who wanted to be at his best.
Yeah, there's a variation on that story that I can share if you'd like.
Yeah, sure.
There was a manager who people weren't really engaged, if you will, in the work in a long-term basis. So I was just sitting down casually with him, and we were going over numbers and things like that. And I said, when someone comes in for a meeting, tell me what happens. He goes, well, I'm so busy. I'm sitting there. They come into the office, emails are popping up, the phone is ringing, and all that kind of stuff's going on. And I said, try something the next time. Someone comes in and you're doing some, goal setting or giving them assignments, whatever. Turn the phone off, turn the PC off, and just talk only to them at the time. Now, get rid of all the distractions. And so then a couple of weeks later, we met again, and he said, it was a dramatic change in that people coming in, when they saw that he was only focused on them, it gave them a sense of what you're doing now, or what you're communicating now to me, must be really important, because you've gotten away from all the distractions. And he said the amount of effort, the amount of engagement that these folks then put in went up considerably, because they felt it was important to him, or was at least important enough to him, that he put aside all those distractions as he gave them their assignments. It was a very interesting story over time that I came across.
I love that.
There's another question I'd love to ask about what you were mentioning about the attrition. And I don't know if you've ever looked at it, but one of the things we found is that as people feel, the most likely people to quit an organization, when you look at the survey data, are oftentimes people who say, by staying here, my skills are rusting. In other words, I'm getting out of date, right? And so I have to leave, because if I don't leave, I'm going to become unemployable long term.
Yeah.
And then the people who are most likely to stay at an organization, who are people who feel like, by staying here, I'm being prepared for the future. I'm getting training. I'm getting my skills are being enhanced and so forth. So I can leave at any time and be up to date with the workforce out there. So in that case, I don't have to leave. Have you ever, when you mentioned that attrition story and the engagement, have you ever looked at what are the drivers of that attrition? Because engagement is sort of like you stick a thermometer in, you say, yeah, we got a fever. But what are the underlying causes of that attrition? And did it relate at all to people's vision of their own personal future at the organization?
Yeah, that's so insightful. Let me see if I can share this. Key point is that when we did our study on both attrition and safety, one of the highest drivers was a question around, am I valued?
Yep.
As an employee? And am I valued? Is, you can take that in a lot of different ways. I would love, as also the head of leadership development and professional skills and learning and ecosystem around learning, I'd love to be able to say it's professional development training alone. But we didn't really find that. We found that being engaged, having meaningful work, those are the types of things that drive people. And so when we centered on what we were going to do as an outcome of that, or as actions based on that outcome study, we really centered on the idea of it's about recognition in terms of feedback. So recognition, yes, we ask about recognition, but it's being seen, being valued, being corrected, maybe when you've done something the wrong way, and having somebody care enough about your success.
Right.
But also, somebody who can appreciate you and reward you, and be able to say thank you. And so that's really what we've been focusing on in this last year. And it has a ton to do with new hires and professional and production employees that, it can go a long way to have somebody know you as a human being, and know if your drivers are, keeping my skills fresh. We've hired tens of, well, I'm trying to think of I couldn't quote you the number right now, but of digital talent that's so hot and coming into the marketplace and being able to attract that group. Now it's a mission of making sure that they feel valued here and they feel that they can keep their skills fresh. And in the production workforce, it's there's not a it's somebody who knows you, maybe knows your kid's name, maybe knows your has some sense, because it does interfere, when you're being asked to work overtime and those types of things. So so it comes down to some pretty human basics of people want to stay sharp and they want to stay employable, but they also want to be cared for and understood as a human being.
Thank you. That's very, very insightful. Let me change topics just slightly. So in your time at Caterpillar, I'm sure you've tried many different things. Is there anything that just didn't work out that you're like, well, we're not going to do that again? Whether it be some kind of special survey or some kind of morphed 360 kind of thing. Is there any advice you can give people in terms of, you may want to stay away from that?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about getting too cutesy with the promotions, just kind of straightforward and the frequency kind of thing. One of our senior HR people at one time really got enamored with the daily smiley face reviews. And I'm sure there are organizations, I've heard a number of presentations around that sort of daily review. But we found in trying to implement it, just the infrastructure around trying to put that in place, it probably had diminishing returns. And I have no data on this, but as I saw the charts of another large retailer, looked amazingly like a weather pattern. So I was just, I'm not the scientist to ask, but so we've explored things like that and decided maybe the effort wasn't worth the value. And right now, I think our biggest focus is on what do we do in the follow-up to support folks, and what do we make sure that we're prioritizing the right things with the outcome studies.
Great. Thank you. So before we get to the questions, and let me take a moment to remind everybody, if you have a question, put it into that Q&A box, and Amanda is monitoring that box. But Kelly, before we jump over to the questions, and I'll ask Amanda to read them to you, take a step back and think of career advice that you might give to people who are, early mid-career kind of things, who may be listening. Any just, here are some 2 or 3 things, 4 things that you may want to consider to help your career?
Yeah. So, I talked about the first job I had with the employee survey. I'm not sure if I shared or not, but the guy I was writing for said, you have an aptitude for numbers and you have an aptitude for stories, and lean into that. So know yourself, I guess. And if it's easy to get feeling stalled, and when you get to those points, it's a good time to reach out for feedback on your career and just ask people, get some other perspectives. And then, be yourself, lean into it. You've got to be open to trying some new things, and the company might push you in that direction, but if you don't really feel it's true to who you are, stay your course.
Got it. Well, thank you. So, Amanda, if you look at the questions that came in, do you want to go through a couple of them?
Sure. All right. Kelly, got a couple of questions here. I'm going to start with this one. Do you think it should be incumbent on the employee or the employer or some combination to ensure that skills are up to date?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because like a lot of learning and development teams, we are, or HR teams generally, we're all about an era of skills. And so we've been talking a lot about making the case, kind of change our whole operating system really to skills based, from the way we acquire talent to thinking about the way in which we move talent in the organization. So we're not unlike a lot of companies that way. And one of our colleagues, as we were presenting this, said to me afterwards, he goes, do we not realize that employees are already there? Candidates are already there. They've been there for some time in social media and other things promoting their skills. It's just that corporate America's infrastructure around talent management needs to catch up a little bit. Our technology is just catching up a little bit. So I think it's incumbent both ways. I think people may have figured it out for themselves that it's a way to be employable, and organizations are realizing that for a number of reasons, skill-based talent management helps us, cast a wider net, helps take out some of the biases and really see, well, what can you actually do? And that's, I think that's a really healthy thing for employers as well.
Great.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have a little bit more time for a couple more. Do you implement learning and development initiatives uniformly across the globe, or do you localize it by country?
Yeah, we in our group, we partner both vertically and horizontally. So we partner with our talent development people in the verticals of each segment of the business. And then we work functionally, like with an engineering group or an accounting group, horizontally. What I feel strongly about, and I'm so proud of our team, is that we've tried to really delve into making access available across the board. So we have a cross section of the L&D team, different groups that have been working on how do we ensure that we have better mental models and checklists for our own inclusion efforts. And a big part of that is being globally inclusive. And so we will try to keep in mind those types of things. But as we were sharing, Jeff, that mental model of how that can, go wrong has been in our DNA for a long time at CAT. What is less apparent, I think, are some of the ways we look at other types of conclusion issues. So, one of our team members said to me recently, I didn't realize how ableist some of our images are, that everybody is, active and moving, and that's not particularly inclusive to folks who might not be as physically able. And so we try to be more conscious of that. I was just looking at our ERGs, our employee resource groups, and there's some, wonderful posts around neurodiversity. So we've tried to kind of at least be aware, and in our own L&D shop have, checklists around what we can do to make sure we're not just coming from our own perspectives. I hope that helps.
Yeah.
Great. And this is the last question. Do you have any advice if you do get pushback from your leadership on the worth of an employee survey? It goes back to the story you were telling at the beginning of the webinar. Yeah. So maybe I will fast forward a few years in that story, and again, because it was really instrumental in my career and amazing, and it might be in others too. So a few years into working on, we got the survey set up, and we started to actually see some really meaningful things in the results that my leadership thought was important to share with the whole of the what we call our operating council, our vice presidents. And, as I mentioned, they were very interested in developing people, as you heard the story of how they had helped, think through what my skills were. And so they offered me an opportunity to talk to the whole of the
to the whole of the operating council, which was pretty intimidating for me at the time. But I had a couple really important moments when that pushback was hit, like full frontal pushback. So imagine like 40 people in the chairs,
Yep.
all white men, one woman. Very intimidating. One guy stands up and said, I don't buy it. This is about 5 minutes into the presentation. And his body language and everything was saying, is this really worth our time? And when you get that kind of pushback about the importance of employee surveys, you don't really know where they're coming from. I didn't know whether he was maybe an engineer that was uncomfortable with social sciences, whether he was just a kind of a weak leader that didn't want to take action. I didn't know whether, he was, had something, meaningful to contribute to what we were doing. So I had the wherewithal to just kind of stop, listen to him. And then other people started chiming in. And mind you, this was early 2000s. But my advice to people when you have pushback is to find the other leaders of the same tier in the organization who can be your advocates. And I kind of looked around the room like, is somebody going to help me out here? While I was on stage, and the gentleman who ended up being our CEO like 2 times later, who was also a credible economist, but also a very strong people advocate, stood up and took him on and said, there's important stuff for us to learn, pointing at him and saying, let her finish. And he went on to share that not only the risk side, but the upside, we should be better at safety. We should be better at, at listening to our employees for quality reasons. And he just made this most eloquent, advocacy. And I didn't have to say a word, and then they were all kind of embarrassed and they're like, please finish. So, I was able to get through it. And I really didn't do any heavy lifting. And I remember getting out of that presentation and walking back with some of the senior leaders, and they're like, home run. I didn't really do anything except have the wherewithal to stop. And if they didn't come to that aid, I would have learned something about the organization very early in my career that would help me make a decision of where I wanted to work. And so I just say, don't take it all on your shoulders, and really try to understand versus advocate by, maybe asking questions.
Well, it sounded like you found a champion in the room, right?
For sure.
And in any large group, there's going to be somebody in there who's going to be a champion, right? And there's going to be somebody else in there who's going to try and cut it down, right?
Right.
It's just, I think, the way it goes. Yeah. I just a quick little story. I was presenting results. I was at it was a steel mill. I won't say which state I was in, but I was at a steel mill, and I was presenting the results, and one of the managers stood up almost violently and said, I haven't spoken to my people in 40 years, and I'm not about to do it now. And I'm like, okay. And one of the things that I've found over the years with that is the people who need the most, who could benefit the most from the employee surveys, are usually the people who are most against it.
Yeah.
And the people who are the champions and advocate for it, they're typically the better managers in the first place.
Right.
So it's very interesting, all these stories.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, we've got 5 minutes left. What I'd like to do is let me share my screen again, and share screen, and I'm going to share this. And I'd like to, all right, everybody should see the slide again, right? And just if we didn't get to your question, give you a second. There's Kelly's email address, and she's again graciously said she will follow up with you if you want to email her with any specific questions. So let me go give you a second to write that down.
While they're doing that, Jeff, I'll say that is me in the excavator at the top and bottom. So this was an opportunity we had with the leadership development to operate. Well, you don't see, oh, you do see the vest there of my friend Justin, who was making sure I didn't go wrong. So
you were digging up some HR reports in those pictures.
oh, yeah.
And what I'd also like to say is we've got 2 more of these sessions. If you enjoyed this session, we have one session coming up November 1st with Chris Rotolo. He's from a company called MyTech, which most of you probably haven't heard of. They are a construction company, and they construct things sort of in a factory and then do assembly on site after the ground has been prepared and all that kind of thing. It's a sort of a newish model of for construction. And I think the most interesting thing there is going to be he walked into this company, which is more or less a startup for him, and he had to build a program from nothing, from zero. And how did he make those decisions as to, what to do first, second, third, in terms of building that capability at MyTech? And then on November 10th, we have Stephanie Murphy coming from Dell, which will talk about the survey research stuff that they do over at Dell. So if you'd like to sign up for any of those, please do so. And one final thing is after you exit this fireside chat, in a few moments, you'll be getting a survey, which is very helpful for us. If you complete the survey, gives us some feedback on the length and the time of day, as well as the relevance of the discussion for the audience. So please take a moment to fill out our survey, because we're a survey company, so you got to do it. Okay, so Kelly, thank you very much. And let me say, any last words you'd like to give anybody?
Yeah, I just say that keep the faith. This is important work in organizations, and take care of yourselves as you do this work. I know with our team, it's full out a lot of effort, and so take care of yourselves and take care of each other, because it's important work to be doing in organizations.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly, for your time, and everybody who's listening in, thank you for your time.